Webinar today. I'm Jenny Merriman, leading through today's webinar with my co-presenters Laura and Ian. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we kick off. There will be time for questions at the end. If you have questions throughout, please do post those in the questions box that will be in your GoToWebinar control panel. Use that box rather than the chat box. And the handout is available also in the handouts box there if you want to download that for your reference. So let's make a start. So I'm Jenny Merriman. I'm the Head of Natural Capital and Biodiversity at WSP in the UK. And I'm going to be doing this presentation today with my colleague Laura and Ian. So I'll just let Laura and Ian say hello before we kick off.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining. So I'm Laura Homfray and I'm an associate and the deputy team lead for Natural Capital and Biodiversity at WSP.
And hello, I'm Ian Dickie. I'm a director of economics for the environment consultancy eftec.
Thanks both. We'll turn our videos off just while we're running through the presentation and then put them back on at the end for the Q&A session. Great, okay. If you could move forward to the agenda then, I will just summarise what we're going to cover. So I'll give a really quick just background to natural capital as a concept, but we're going to focus most of today's presentation on a case study of work that we have done with Transport for London, and then there'll be some time at the end for Q&A. So natural capital is a concept that allows us to think about the natural environment in terms of it being an asset. So we think about it in a way that stocks provide us with flows of benefits, often called ecosystem services, that provide value to society, and that value can be measured in different ways: qualitative, quantitative and monetary metrics. Biodiversity is an essential component of natural capital, and we'll talk about how we incorporated biodiversity into this natural capital account. On the next slide, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, and the state of natural capital is fundamental in underpinning delivery of all of the societal and economic Sustainable Development Goals. As you can see here, the 4 goals related to the biosphere, that's 15, 14, 6 and 13, all underpin the rest of sustainable development. So the state of nature is material to all of us, and that's really why natural capital and natural capital accounting is being picked up by so many corporates and other entities globally. So we're going to focus on the work that we are just completing at the moment with Transport for London. So Transport for London, for those of you that don't know, is an integrated transport authority. They're responsible for meeting the London Mayor's strategy and commitments on transport in London, and they run the day-to-day operation of London's public transport network, as well as managing London's main roads. So some stats here: they have a bus fleet of over 9,000 vehicles, 11 underground lines, including the new Elizabeth line, which has just opened this month. And they serve 5 million tube passengers a day, and also manage travel on the River Thames as well. They own nearly 4,000 hectares of land, most of which is understandably developed as road and rail infrastructure, but some of that land is also undeveloped, and that's where we were focusing the natural capital account. So some key highlights before we just get into the detail a little bit of the work. We used the Natural Capital Protocol as a framework to apply the natural capital approach and to undertake the account. We looked at the natural capital assets using spatial data that was already held by TfL from previous work. We helped to develop internal capacity and understanding about how nature and natural capital is relevant to the organisation. and also did quite a bit of facilitation of focus group discussions and workshops to help identify opportunities and risks related to natural capital. And what we've just finished doing this week is looking at the key opportunities to embed that thinking into decision making. So working with us, we had eftec, who have used their in-house natural capital accounting approach and methodology, drawing on best practice, also aligning the work with the recently released British standard for natural capital accounting, and who have conducted several knowledge sharing sessions with TfL staff to help transfer over the knowledge on how to create and update a natural capital account going forward. So I mentioned the natural capital protocol, which has 4 stages. So the first 2 of these we kicked off last year, and then the second 2, measure and value and apply, the 2 that we're going to really focus on for this presentation. So just briefly to look at the frame, the reason why TfL wanted to understand how natural capital applies to them is really to incorporate it into their asset strategy, project lifecycle decision making, with the purpose of improving business performance, reducing risk, and delivering better environmental outcomes for Londoners as key stakeholders and the UK as a whole. And something that's really important before getting into the detail of measuring and valuing natural capital is to understand the scope and the boundary of what you're going to be looking at. So we developed a scope organisational focus looking across different elements of their work, so projects, new developments, maintenance activities, and also the operational phase of their assets. But the value chain boundary was focused quite tightly on their estate, so land that they own, and all activities that directly impact that land, so the physical attributes of that land, excluding any wider supplier impacts, and equivalent to Scope 1 if you're talking about the British standard. So I'm going to hand over to Laura to take us through a bit more information about the second phase of the project.
So, thanks, Jenny. So as part of the second phase of the measure and value stage that we kicked off this year, we started off by doing a review of the initial scope and materiality assessment that we completed as part of phase 1. And then we started collating data to actually build the evidence base for the natural capital account. eftec then went on to create a British standard compliant natural capital account, and Ian's going to go into a bit more detail about this in the next slide. And we undertook a pilot project assessment of an account at a project level. So for this, we ran a natural capital account, an urban greening factor assessment, and a nature tool assessment on a live project happening in TfL on an approximately 4-hectare site to get an idea of how the natural capital account and natural capital assessments could be applied at a project level as well as an estate-wide level. We identified any gaps and opportunities for incorporating natural capital data within TfL, and we also did a range of workshops. So we did 3 workshops with TfL staff looking at data, 1 focused on data, 1 focused on projects, and 1 focused on the maintenance and operations of TfL's natural capital assets. And then we also did a more sort of in-depth focused workshop, sort of training style session for those who were going to be involved in actually updating the natural capital account going forwards for TfL. And we did a few knowledge exchange webinars with other key stakeholders in the business so that we could update everybody on the findings of the work that we've been doing. So what you can see on the screen right now is some pictures of Transport for London's estate. So if you look at the picture on the left there, you can see the total extent of the land owned by Transport for London. As you may expect, a lot of it is surrounding roads and railways because the majority of TfL's land is developed and is part of the transport network. And if you look to the image on the right, that's just a zoomed in idea of one of the sections of land which shows some of the habitats that are likely present. So for example, a lot of the estate is along road verges, so it may be sort of amenity grasslands along the side of the roads, and also lines of trees and things that are most likely present across the estate. So before this project, the account that we generated as part of this project with eftec is actually based on some work that WSP completed with TfL quite a while ago in 2018, which was a biodiversity baseline across their entire estate that was gathered using a range of data from TfL, GIGGLE, so that's the green space information for Greater London, and Natural England, so using the Natural England priority habitat data set. And we filled in any gaps for the biodiversity baseline data using remote sensing algorithms. So that sort of gave TfL a solid baseline of their biodiversity value of their assets with almost no gaps. And so as part of this, we calculated the biodiversity units associated with the biodiversity on their site, and that was done using the Natural England and DEFRA metric. So the metric generates numerical scores based on the habitat's distinctiveness and condition, and those are then multiplied together with either the area in hectares or the length in kilometres of habitat to produce a biodiversity unit score for each habitat type. So this work was actually the basis of the for developing the natural capital assessment and account. And the units were directly from this assessment were directly incorporated into the account. So the account presents the total biodiversity units of TfL's estate, which is 8,171 biodiversity units. The estate's got potential for enhancing the bird biodiversity value for the delivery of biodiversity net gain targets, either for TfL's own developments or potentially as offsets for other organisations. So natural capital accounting, this is where I pass to Ian, who's going to go into a bit more depth about the account that eftec developed.
Indeed, thank you, Laura. So for those not familiar with natural capital accounting, it summarised the method in the questions down the left-hand side of this diagram. So there's important to set a clear scope of the account. So it starts with asking what natural capital assets are owned or managed and being included in the account. And those are recorded in asset register. And then based on that, we can start to assess the flows of benefits the assets produce, and particularly want to focus on the most material flows of benefits. And if those benefits can be quantified and measured, so we often use ecosystem services approaches, then we can apply monetary valuation to value those benefits. The fourth question is also a very important one that we ask: what are the costs of maintaining the natural capital assets? And I'll come back to the importance of that in the results we look at, because it allows the fifth question to be answered about the comparison across the balance sheet. So you can see we're using terms here like asset register and schedules of costs. So we're mimicking some financial accounting kind of structures and approaches. And that's important because we're trying to have a structure that generates data that can be comparable across time. So TfL can track their trends, but also between organizations, so data is comparable. On the next slide, we can see some of the results from the asset register. So unsurprisingly, the majority of estates not made up of natural capital assets. It's built transport infrastructure and other infrastructure. But then of the natural capital assets, we can break those down to the main habitat types. You can see a lot of it's urban, which includes some of that amenity grassland and obviously other typical urban habitats, but there are also a range of other habitats, as Laura was saying. And as she also mentioned, what's important is this data is linked to the biodiversity baseline that can be used for biodiversity net gain. And what that means is that the account results in terms of natural capital values are connected to the data in the organization to help implement biodiversity net gain and comply with those requirements. And that's important because we don't want decisions about biodiversity net gain to be made in one silo and decisions about natural capital to be made in another. We need the data to join up to enable joined up decision making. So based on these habitats, we can do a number of calculations of the benefits they provide. And this is a natural capital balance sheet from the account, summarises the results. If you're not familiar with this kind of structure, I'll just talk you through it. So the rows at the top show a range of different asset values. So those are values for the range of benefits we were able to put monetary values on. You can see at the sort of left-hand column under asset values. And you can see across the columns then that we distribute those values across different groups. So the value to TfL itself in financial terms, the value to Londoners, and then the carbon sequestration has value to global society. And that distribution is very important because you can see only a very small amount of the value returns directly to TfL as financial benefits, but there's a large amount of value to people in London. And ultimately TfL is there as an organisation to serve and provide value to people in London. So it's very important to illustrate that distribution of benefits. And those benefits are totaled up in the right-hand column. But then we can't expect to capture all the benefits from the natural environment in monetary terms. So you can see that in the sort of middle section of the table, there are some other asset values that are not in monetary terms using the biodiversity unit score. And also an important metric, we were able for the WSP team to do some innovative mapping to identify where trees were potentially providing a visual screening benefit. And that's an important risk for future management because it's the sort of benefit that local people might object to losing if habitat management changed. You can see at the bottom, we haven't quite finalized the liability section, which is those maintenance costs. And that's because it's quite difficult to disaggregate some of the health and safety vegetation management costs from the cost of maintaining natural capital assets, keeping the environment healthy. But when we've done that, we will have a comparison between those costs and the benefits provided. And that comparison is a really important one because what it stimulates you to ask is, well, are we spending enough money? Are those maintenance costs currently adequate to maintain the environment in good condition to keep providing those benefits that are shown in the table into the future? You can see the unit is PV60, which means that we've calculated the present value of those benefits over 60 years. So we're basically saying the value of the environment as an asset is based on the value of the benefits it can provide to society over 60 years. 60 years is used because it's the UK Treasury recommended timeframe. So it's a forward-looking account and it brings out a comparison between the costs we put into managing the environment and the benefits we want to get from it in the future. Thanks, and back to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Ian. So we then moved on from the account to focus on the apply stage of the natural capital protocol. So the account was focusing on the measure and value stage, and then we had a look at the apply stage. So as part of this stage, we ran 3 different workshops, and the main focus of these was to really try and figure out a way that the account and findings from it could be embedded within existing sort of standards and processes at TfL. So we split the 3 groups into data. So how is the business data currently collated? Who is responsible for what? Where do the data analysis skills sit? And what data platforms are there? And then projects was our second focus group. So how could natural capital information add value to decision making on project developments? And at what stage in the project development should we be capturing this information? We also had a workshop on maintenance and operations that looked at the key policies and management standards that are used for operations and maintenance work and how they interact with the material natural capital benefits identified in the natural capital account and whether there was any scope to actually increase these material natural capital benefits. There was also a focus on risk management more generally that came up within these focus groups. So attention was often on how risks, whether they're project related or maintenance focused, could be captured and recorded within TfL's variety of risk management systems. So in terms of the key challenges for developing this account, TfL is quite a large organisation with a complex structure, and it's predominantly got linear and fragmented land ownership, so it's not ideal for looking at natural asset management. It's also important to consider the context of the TfL estate because one of their core functions is, of course, to run a safe and efficient transport network across London. Trees adjacent to railway lines, for example, could cause leaves to fall on the line, which in turn can cause train delays. So where natural capital assets are created or enhanced is actually particularly important in this context. In terms of data availability and reliability, the initial natural capital account is often described as a sort of data management exercise. And it was actually a pretty fascinating exercise because as TfL was searching for colleagues who held relevant data across the business, they'd keep coming back throughout the process with more and more data that was being collated, which had relevance to the natural capital account. Some of the data, which was quite challenging to find, as Ian mentioned on the previous slide, was data that related to the costs for creating and maintaining natural assets. It was also pretty challenging to gather data that looked at some of the possible benefits, like doing the visual screening of the trees, for example. It's worth bearing in mind that this was a huge data set of over 400,000 polygons, so it would have needed significant extra time to run a viewshed analysis, for example, to assess the potential visual screening benefits associated with trees. And quantify material impacts and dependencies. So there were a couple of pieces, mental health benefits and educational value, that came up in the materiality assessment that we just weren't able to quantify or monetize at this stage. And that's just because there isn't a robust method out there at the moment for quantifying or monetizing these particular benefits. Finally, it was a novel way of thinking, so there was a constant process of development, upskilling and integration. This account was a new process for TfL, so it did require a lot of engagement with different parts of the business. And although it was something new that required thinking about environmental data in a different way to usual, TfL very much rose to the challenge, and they were really engaged throughout the process, provided excellent inputs during our workshop activities to support the development of the natural capital account at both at a statewide and a project level. So some of the key innovations. This was actually the first statewide natural capital account that we're aware of in the UK for an infrastructure provider at this scale. It's also one of the first we're aware of that uses a biodiversity baseline that's been completed to build the account. And there was a lot of engagement, as I've already mentioned, throughout the project across various teams in TfL, so that we could build awareness, foster ownership, and generate support for adoption of this account going forwards. Finally, our key takeaways from this project. So TfL's natural capital assets do support significant value to Londoners and also to global society. The net asset value reflects a subset of benefits that are captured in the monetary terms. The costs are mostly dominated by TfL's operational requirements. So, for example, removing vegetation to comply with health and safety standards. This was obviously TfL's first attempt as well at developing a baseline natural capital account. So there is room for improvement, as it is just the first time that they've been engaged with this. It's worth noting more generally that accounting frameworks are never going to capture all of the values for the natural environment. Will only ever be a partial measure of value. And there are data gaps at present that we would like to include, and some aspects that we couldn't include, like social considerations. It would be best to update the account regularly to reflect the trends over time, and also update some of the methods that we use to gather the data within the account. Finally, the natural capital account adoption will require a lot of embedding work from within TfL, so that those in the business are upskilled and able to deliver this account in the years to come. So that's all from me and the rest of us too, but does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask about the account?
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Ian. So as I said at the beginning, if you do have questions, please do pop those into the questions box that you'll see. I can see a couple in there already, so I'm just going to pick one of those. So perhaps firstly for Ian, how do we bring natural capital accounting together with carbon accounts and similar regimes?
Yeah, well, the key is to linking up the data through the asset register. So carbon sequestration was one of the benefits in the balance sheet, and the same assumptions that would be used for a carbon footprint can be used in the account, so calculating the sequestration and also, if necessary, the carbon stock stored in vegetation. You could extend the scope of the account to scope 2 in the British standard, and you would then bring in emissions from the value chain, so from the supply chain of materials and fuels used within TfL operations. But as a natural capital account, this focused on sequestration and storage in and out of vegetation.
Thanks, Ian. There's also a question about the stakeholder engagement. So obviously we ran this project in the last year. So the question is, how did we do those workshops and sessions? Were they run face-to-face or another way? So Laura, I wonder whether you want to summarise what we did there.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. So for the workshops, obviously we weren't actually able to do these face-to-face because it was in the last year. So what we found quite successful in the end was we used a software platform called Miro that we would sort of set out boards, they're called, which would provide a way for the attendees to put post-it notes with information about what they wanted to say and add it to the board. So in that sense, it made it quite inclusive, because those who didn't feel comfortable speaking up in the session were still able to sort of add their comments and thoughts to the notes. And then at the end of that, it also gave us a really great visual that we could collate and add into TfL's reports. So I think it worked quite well in the end. Once we managed to get through some of the usual difficulties of people being on mute, etc., as you always do when you're running these types of virtual presentations. But yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Another one for Ian. So it's a question about the monetised values. So where did the monetised values come from? Are they backed up by literature or government sources or created in-house? Oh, I think you might be muted, Ian.
Yeah, they all come from peer-reviewed literature and government sources.
No, that's good. We can hear you now. I think there was just a delay, perhaps.
I should be unmuted now, is that? Okay, sorry. Yeah, the sources come from peer-reviewed material, and there's a UK government guide called ENCA, Enabling a Natural Capital Approach, which has a number of sort of databases of references of recommended studies in it, and that's very useful to show that we're using sort of government-supported evidence base. A lot of it comes from academic work, but has been applied in different policy situations and also UK national ecosystem accounts. And then those models are sort of tested and reviewed and able to be applied with confidence at an organisational level.
Thanks, Ian. I've got another one about the biodiversity assessment. So Laura, probably to you.
Yeah, probably one for me.
Yeah. So it says, when working out the biodiversity value, did you do any on-the-ground field survey and condition assessment, and if so, how much?
So as part of this project, we haven't, but that was quite a lot. So that the original work that we did was in 2018. So the biodiversity baseline data has been updated since, and the process by which it's updated is actually that Transport for London are linked up with GIGGLE, so the Green Space Information for Greater London teams. And anytime they're going to do sort of a new development on their projects, they actually they require contractors to supply them with the GIS data, which they then pass on to GIGGLE, who then use it to update the overall TfL baseline. So it's likely that some of the data that we gathered originally in 2018 has now been updated as a result of these live projects that are going on. The other thing that it's important to flag around this is that the vast majority of the estate is of quite low biodiversity value because of the nature of it. So we didn't feel like we were missing out on lots and lots of key information in relation to the biodiversity on the site, because it was just, you know, regularly mown grass adjacent to roads and things like this. But I think TfL will be updating it going forwards as part of their live projects.
Thanks, Laura. And then one more that's come in, which is in relation to whether natural capital accounting is likely to become mandatory. I don't know whether that's in relation to kind of UK or international. And then how does it relate to the new task force for nature-related financial disclosure?
I can start on that, Jenny. So I don't know if mandated is expected maybe in the near future, so the next few years, but you know, some reporting requirements like around carbon have progressed quite rapidly, so we shouldn't rule it out. But what's more likely is it'll become a more common requirement either from investors and including for those looking for information that complies with the TNFD framework. And that framework does require an understanding of assets and other information that are produced through the accounts, and they're produced through the accounts in a systematic and kind of auditable structure. So it's a very good way of complying with many of the aspects of TNFD. Obviously, the disclosure framework within that is still under development, so we have to learn exactly how well they overlap.
Yeah, and from my sort of experience talking to clients and peers through engagement with the TNFD forum, it's definitely a lot of interest in it, you know, and how it does relate to ways in which corporations and others are already looking at biodiversity, risk and opportunity in natural capital. So yeah, I think there will be some close alignment there as that framework develops. Just check in case there's one more to pick up. So let's just tackle this last one and I think we better wrap up. So are there plans to increase the biodiversity of the roadside grasslands to increase the score and the value? Yes, I think. So from discussions with TfL and some of the data that we've included in the account, we've been looking at wildflower verges along the road, so the road network, which is managed a bit separately from the rail side of things. So there are some trials going on looking at how biodiversity can be increased and what the management changes might be, and also therefore the cost changes in terms of probably mowing a lot less than is currently being done. And that data will feed through into this account as a way to capture those improvements, as well as obviously on a biodiversity baseline enhancement update as well. So yeah, that's a long answer, but yes. Okay, I think we'll wrap it up as we're a few minutes over. So just thank you everybody for joining us for this session. Hope you found it useful. Do download the handout if you'd like to, and we wish you a pleasant rest of the day.